I was a kid that was raised in rural Maryland by two academics who were terrified that I was expressing in music from a very young age. I think both of them very much wanted me to be a doctor or a lawyer, and it was, I grew up in a very sort of socially conservative area, so being a musician was a pretty radical thing. And I went to the Washington Conservatory of Music. I studied piano, Suzuki method as a child, and studied orchestration, counterpoint, theory, conducting, what have you, with a phenomenal teacher named Satiris Vlahopoulos. And then I ended up going to Berklee School of Music after conservatory, and at the age of 15, studying contemporary music, jazz, expanded harmony and tonality, and furthering my study of orchestration and those kind of things. And along the way in there, I fell in love with synthesizers and synthesis via a lot, honestly, of English music and culture, early new wave music, and also too through breakdancing music and culture. And so that immediately spurned this idea, or sort of spurred this idea rather in me, that the composers that I had studied my whole young life, were they to be alive today, many of them would be using synthesis as a modality for creation, because it represents this infinite sonic palette. You're not limited to instruments, specifically from the orchestra. And so I was really taken by synthesis immediately, and also too drawn to bands like Depeche Mode and New Order and some of these early new wave bands, the Human League, things like this. And so I started collecting synthesizers throughout my youth, and then it really is these kind of two things commingling that makes me what I am. So I'm someone that loves electronics, digital signal processing, and electronic music, yet was a conservatory brat. So I suppose that my work is characteristic of the love of those two things. Early in my career, I was looking for a vehicle to release music, and I came up at a time in the 90s that was different to now, with social media and all the ways that we have to disseminate and distribute music. And so, of course, I was going around and trying to shop record deals, playing people music that I recorded, and they would say, wait a second, this thing's 11 minutes long and in 5 movements, and there's no vocals, and is there a drummer, and I don't really understand this. So I ended up finding a home, not so ironically, because I grew up loving English music so much in England. And so a DJ by the name of Sasha asked me to come to England. He heard the first record that I put out on a small label called Deep Dish. And those guys have gone on to have phenomenal careers. Ali and Sharon and won Grammys and all sorts. And we sold our junker cars, and I released a piece of house music on Deep Dish before really there was even that name, house music. And so Sasha got a copy of this record, and he said, he rang me up, and I still don't know how he got my number actually. He rang me up and he said, I'd love to have you over here. People are going to really like what you do in England. And so I went to England for the first time, and I signed my record deal with Warner Brothers on that trip. So, and then subsequently I lived on and off in England through the 90s and did everything from play Glastonbury to breakfast television. So England really became this kind of second home to me, and that's really how my career began. It wasn't until much later that I started composing for film, which is what I actually studied to do. Ironically, because I became known for electronic music and specifically for trance, and that there was no name for that at the time that I started making it either. And so because during that time period people knew me for this one specific thing, it was actually very difficult for me to get jobs in film, especially where I would be beholden to writing for live sections and orchestras and this sort of thing. So it took a lot of convincing for people after I was kind of an established commodity that I actually, I studied this my entire life, and I'm qualified to do it. I moved to Los Angeles in the early 2000s, and I started scoring films and scored movies like The Fast and Furious and Monster with Charlize Theron, and I've done a couple films with her and things for Pixar and all sorts. I just finished a movie this year with Anthony Hopkins called Soulless, and one of the things that's so fun for me after getting over that hurdle of saying, no, hey, I really can stand with a baton and conduct and so on and so forth, which people are super freaked out by because they have this image of you standing with turntables or a synthesizer. It's not really, it sort of doesn't fit together in their mind, that paradigm with orchestral music. But after having a handful of things under my belt, it's so much fun now getting hired on things where I get to experiment with not just electronics and digital signal processing, but also with the orchestra. So this film that I just completed called Soulless, I did a bunch of almost Steve Reich sort of things where I hired some musicians from MIT who are friends from development friends at Isotope. And they're frustrated musicians. They're amazing classical musicians, but they're also engineers and scientists and stuff. So people don't typically ask them to play on things, you know? And so I hired this small quintet, actually, 3 cello and 2 contrabass, and I let them improvise, and I would write these motifs, and we did things where the motifs would come out of sync with one another, almost in a sort of Steve Reich type thing, and line up at certain periods. And that was sort of the thing that is unnerving about that score. It's a thriller. The score is unnerving as opposed to the typical way that you scare an audience, you know? So it's been a really fun journey for me to arrive at a point where I get to combine all the different facets of what I love into one sort of thing. There's a director called Doug Liman that's gone on to do the Bourne Supremacy things and some fantastic films. He'd done a film called Swingers, his first movie, hysterical film actually, with Vince Vaughn. And so he literally came to my home with his dog. This is a true story. Crazily, I was telling this story the other day. He came to my home and he knocked on my door and he said, my name's Doug Liman and I'm a director and I'd love it if you look at my movie and I'd like for you to score it. And so I was like, this is strange. I live out in the country. You know, I'm like, how did you find me? And so anyway, he came in my home and we sat down together and I figured out how the sort of thread that connected the two of us. And we really had a very immediate rapport creatively. And that's one of the things, and people that watch this will know this, that all of us aspire to as composers, is to find a director that we communicate in the same vernacular. And it's rare. It's very, very rare. I can say that there are 2 or 3 people that I've found where I can really communicate with them in this very emotional language that is not strictly music. You know, it's some kind of colloquial in between regular talking and music. I had ideas for what he wanted to do immediately, and his movie was about early rave culture. And so, you know, I knew the sound family that he was looking for, and it was tough, though, going from that movie to the first thing that I wrote for orchestra, again, because of this perceptual issue. So it really wasn't until the first Fast and Furious that I got to combine my love for electronic music with orchestra and, you know, taking things like chucking 8 chimbasso parts through Marshall half stacks. So I had to twist a lot of people's arms to get to the point where I got to do some of those things. But yeah, working with Doug was my first break. I'd say one of my strong suits, if I'm self-evaluating, is this really molecular attention to detail. So, and I really try to, from a macro perspective, approach all of the work that I do, whether it's writing for cello and hammered dulcimer or circuit bend instruments in some crazy digital signal processing operation, the same way, which is this really, really micro attention to detail. So in my own personal workflow, I find frequently that I have compositional ideas that I can't achieve by means of an acoustic instrument or a piece of commercially available software. And that really was the impetus for starting a software company. Was there were so many compositional ideas that I had that walls that I would hit where I'd say, well, you can't ask a violist to play 2048th notes. It certainly can't ask them to spline exponentially from 2048th notes down to eighth note. It's an unplayable figure. So, I think that might be something really cool. So I have to find a way to do that. So at the same time I fell in love with synthesizers, I fell in love with computers. So I taught myself to program in very early languages like BASIC, BASIC A, even some COBOL and Pascal, believe it or not. So dating myself a little bit. And so I'm a bit of a hack in things like C, C++, Objective-C, C#, these kind of things. But I'm actually really good at prototyping in languages like Max MSP, which is a more music-based language, and C Sound I studied at university with Dr. Richard Boulanger. So these are ways that I can take these crazy compositional ideas I may have and build a working prototype and then see if that idea is something that warrants pursuing that may bear fruit. So at any rate, yeah, that's a very big part of my compositional process. It's funny because in so many environments I find myself in, I feel just slightly outside of my peer group, and being at a thing like NAMM, getting to, for example, sit backstage with the Rolly Dev guys and really drill down on some of the things that they're working on right now. I feel like it's like my tribe, it's my people. And so I find myself, frequently in situations performing in some, festival, what have you, or and talking about kick drums and mastering, and which is awesome, and I love talking about, or in meetings talking with directors where we're trying to work out this, like I was saying, this kind of vernacular of transposing normal speech to music, which is, you get certain directors saying, oh, this needs to be a little bit more blue, or can this be more open, these kind of things. So it's wonderful for me being in an environment where there is this group of people that sort of ride the line between music and technology, because that's really where I found myself my whole life. And it didn't really make sense until, I guess about 10 years into my career, where I started getting to express in all of these areas, in development, in composition, using electronics, using all these different means of expression. And I find so much inspiration too from development is just extraordinary. And it really is, I hit these compositional walls where I can't do something that I have in my head. And I'd say half the time it doesn't merit doing. So that's a part of, and as we all know as musicians, a part of the process is you sit down and you think, I have this great idea, and you try it, and it might not have been what you thought, but the half the times, if you're lucky, a third the times, even if you're lucky, that it is something magical, it's amazing. Those are the moments we live for as composers, And so it's the same thing with software development. And so I just absolutely love it. It's just such an exciting thing to participate in. So we've had a great time working on Phobos. It's been amazing. Martin's an absolute wizard. And as we were talking about off camera, he works in a language that is, I actually want to learn Juice. I think it's amazing. And I've noodled around in there a little bit, but it's incredible the complexity that you can get in Juice quickly. And so I know that it's something that when I go to universities now and speak in these kind of things, it's exciting to see that being taught, because it does make the digital signal processing operations a lot easier to codify. So yeah, anyway, we can nerd all day. So when I was at university, I studied with a mentor of mine named Dr. Richard Boulanger, who's an absolute genius and a lovely human being too. And Dr. B was one of the first people that exposed me to spectral convolution. In fact, I believe his doctoral thesis is on convolution. So it was cool. I was exposed to it by my professor when I was in college. And one of the things that I thought about convolution as a specific area of interest is how we've, at least in music, obviously in science, convolution is used for completely dissimilar things, and actually very interesting things that have possible transpositions into music. I'll leave that for a moment. Convolution as an idea was so computationally intensive at the time I learned about it as to be unfeasible on computers of the time. So I always had this idea in the back of my head. Certainly there's other things that can be done with convolution other than emulating reverbs or guitar amps and what have you, which is amazing as well. So it wasn't until, I would say, a good 6 years ago that I had this crazy idea. What if you made impulse responses that had an inherent tonality to them? And further, what if these impulse responses had palindromic loops in them and were using really interesting instruments and sound design? And then subsequent to that, I thought, wow, now what if you made them so you could change the pitch of them? And then subsequent to that, the idea was, what if you turned that idea into a full-blown polyphonic synthesizer where you're using impulse responses and then feeding some kind of rhythmic stimulus into them? And one of the real challenges that we have in film composition, because film composition and television and video games and all of that is often, so much of it is about subtlety. So of course you have in movies where things blow up and even in things where they don't, these big, huge, epic moments. But more than not, we're writing things to support dialogue, to support very subtle, as emotional counterpoint to interaction between two characters, again, depending on the subject material. And so there's that expression, you don't need a sledgehammer to crack an egg. And we want to keep the scene moving forward and the emotional integrity of what's happening without adding something rhythmic to it that's so overly complex that it speaks more than what's happening visually. You know, we're there to support what's happening visually. And so I think that that's a conundrum that a lot of composers face, is how do I, coming back to the ostinato word, how do I make some kind of rhythmic ostinato, that this pulse or meter that carries forward the dialogue and the action, but that's not over the top. It's not an arpeggio. It's not some big marcato string figure. And so I had the idea, what if we take these really cool, everything from sort of very standard, if you will, cinematic big taiko rhythms and things like that, right through to these kind of molecular, micro-rhythmic figures, and we make those rhythmic stimulus for these impulses. What would that sound like? And so I started playing around with this idea, and it was extraordinary immediately, the content, the feedback from mixing those two things. And it was around that time that we, meaning myself and the Spitfire family, started communicating about this, and everyone got really, really excited. And that really was the spark that started this fire. So that's how we got to this moment, was from this crazy idea. I'm a Spitfire user, so I know about and started iterating and interacting with the Spitfire team because I love the Spitfire products. They're awesome. And so I was really excited in talking to Paul and Christian Stanley and everyone that they were interested in making something that was not just a sound library, which is obviously what they're rightfully known for as, a force to be reckoned with. So we originally talked about, it'd be really cool if you made a kind of signature library. And I said, that's cool, I can definitely do that. And I have this crazy idea about using convolution as a synthesis modality. And they said, tell us more about that. I started putting together some little proof of concepts and sending them through. And then everybody's freaking out like 4-year-olds. And we decided to build a synthesizer. So it's taken us 2 years, but it's been amazing, an absolutely amazing experience. I can't wait to hear how end users use this product, because I know they're going to do things with it that I have not even imagined. It's such a wide net of sonic capability, this plugin. And so it's going to be so exciting to hear this in films, in trailers, in video games, and see how other people use this new technique for combining rhythms with tonality. I think what's so exciting about Phobos is that it's an amazing starting point for if you're working on something to picture. And also too, we're shortchanging this in a sense a bit, because my dance music friends that I've played this for are all like, I want to be on beta, freaking out, because it is appealing to that world and that community too, because it doesn't have to be subtle, but it really excels at these beautiful, elegant, liquid sounding, tonal pulsing spaces. And so I really see it as, and that said, you can make these huge things too with these crazy microrhythmic figures and massive drums. The library that we've developed for it is crazy. And I can't remember the actual size. Christian would remember. It's massive. It's a very big library of both rhythmic figures and these incredibly elegant spatial kind of ambiances and textures. And so I would say that one of the places I know a lot of the film guys are going to use this is the sort of thing, we've just put this randomize function in it too that's amazing. So if you hold Alt, you can randomize just through loops. And if you, there's another modifier key, I can't think of it at the moment, you hold and it will randomize just through textures. And so you can really quickly pick 4 loops and pick 3 impulse responses, and immediately you have this percolating, pulsing, rhythmic thing. And of course, too, it's going to ship with some really phenomenal presets and patches. The way I anticipate seeing composers use this, and my friends of all different, sides of the spectrum compositionally, are going to be using this, I think, just sitting with something that doesn't have any temp, or that may have temp, and they think, oh, I need to do something kind of this tempo, and just flipping through patches and literally holding down a chord. And some of the presets that, toot my own horn a little bit, I'm really excited about the presets I've been working on. Some of the presets I've made are quite literally 1 or 2 fingers down, and it's a completed score cue. So I anticipate that people are going to be watching picture and have some semblance of idea in terms of tempi where they want to be working. Just grab a chord and immediately flipping through patches, you have these insanely different vibes. One of the coolest things too about Phobos is that you're able to have isorhythmic figures that function as the stimuli for the impulse responses. So you have these things that are turning around in different meters and will line up isorhythmically. So one of the things that I've heard many times when getting notes for me as a composer is, oh, this bit sounds a little bit too loopy, right? There's too much of a loop. We want it to grow and this pulse to change there. So if you're working in a traditional sense with loops, you are in fact beholden to the loop, and you must cut them up and do something interesting with them to make it so it doesn't sound, for lack of a better term, loopy. This is inherently built into the idea of this plugin, that so many of the patches are things that change and evolve over time. So you literally can hold a chord on some of these patches for 5 minutes. It's not going to do the same thing. So I really anticipate seeing people use this, just literally flipping through presets to picture. And it's a heavy, intensive pressure environment working in film and television. And these are unbelievable starting places for score cues.